Well, good afternoon and welcome back from the break, everyone. I'm pleased to announce the next lecture. We're going to hear about SIP, Session Initiation Protocol Security, from Jan Seedorf from the University of Hamburg. And we all are used to treating telephone protocols as inherently secure. Now, that's probably not true, otherwise he wouldn't be standing here and giving us this lecture. And he's going to guide us through a little bit of history of SIP and, well, future extensions and what can be done there and what actually is not done security-wise. Jan, you have it. Enjoy.
Thank you for the introduction. Is my microphone on? Can you hear me from this? Yeah? Okay. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Jan Seedorf. I work at the University of Hamburg in the Security and Distributed Systems group. And what I will talk about today is zip security, and I subtitled the talk Status Quo and Future Issues. What I will talk about is what's going on today, but also have an outlook on some future networks and what the problems will be there. So what's my intention today? First of all, I want to show you some differences between the public switch telephone network that we use today and zip-based voice over IP. And I hope that during this talk you will realize that these differences really affect security for zip. So this is what I will start with. Then I want to give you an overview of current work that's going on in zip security, and hopefully you get an insight on what's going on. And unfortunately I cannot show you everything, but I've chosen some important areas of work that I will talk about. And finally, I will give you an outlook on security issues in future, namely peer-to-peer zip networks. This is not even being standardized yet, but this is has been proposed by some researchers, and I've looked into the security implications of such an approach. So here's my agenda. First of all, I give you a short overview over voice over IP and how signaling with zip is really done. Then, like I said, we'll talk about differences to the public switch telephone network. Then I'll show you some current research problems and what's been done there to solve these problems. Talk about security in peer-to-peer zip networks. And finally, I will conclude. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with voice over IP and zip, I'll give you a short introduction. First of all, what is voice over IP? Quite often you find this definition here, the transmission of digitized voice over an IP-based network. Now if you think about this, you might say, well, if I send an MP3 file via email to a friend of mine, this is voice over IP. Well, according to this definition, yes. So we might want to add the real-time transmission. And what we usually have with voice over IP, and that's quite important, is the separation of signaling and media transfer. And during the next couple of slides, I show you what this means and how this is being done. And what's happening with voice over IP is that during the last couple of years, it's really matured. Zip has emerged as a widely used standard. There are lots of zip providers out there. In Germany, there are plenty. At least I know that, and in the US. And there are plenty of zip phones. You can buy them. You can buy zip adapters and everything. And I'd like to ask the audience, who's using voice over IP? Okay, that's about more than half. Who's using Skype of those? Well, not so many. That's good, because I won't be talking about Skype today. Who's using zip? Okay, that's why you're in this talk, probably, to find out if it's secure what you're using. Well, that's good. So what is zip? It stands for Session Initiation Protocol. It's a protocol standardized by the IETF. And basically what it is, it's an application layer signaling protocol for multimedia sessions. Now, as you can tell, this means this is not only for voice over IP. You can use it for chatting, for presence services, for online gaming, for all kinds of things, for video conferencing. But of course, it's also used for voice over IP. And after the session has been set up, the media transfer then is done with the real-time transfer protocol, usually. So here's a couple of things that zip supports. It's not really important for zip security here today. So let's go right into an example. Well, I have a little bit of trouble here because what you usually should see here are domains. This is a domain here, and here's also a domain. But this is the first beamer I've had that doesn't show these domain domains here, but that's not a problem. So how does zip work? Like I've said, we have a domain here. This is Alice's domain, and this is Bob's domain. And then we have a DNS server here somewhere on the internet. Now, excuse me, if Alice and Bob want to communicate, what they first need is they need a zip URI. And zip communication is based on the URI, which you can see here. Alice has the URI alice@atlanta.com, and Bob has a URI like bob@biloxi.com. This is pretty similar to an email address. So for now, consider this just like an email address. Now the zip then is an ASCII-based text protocol, so it really is just text messages that are being sent from A to B, and this is requests and responses, just like you have in HTTP. So if Bob wants to receive messages, first of all, he has to register his zip URI. So he sends a register message to his local registrar, which then stores the binding of his zip URI and his current IP address at a location service. Now then, if Alice wants to call Bob, she sends an invite message to her local zip proxy, who then needs to do a DNS lookup to find out under what IP address he can reach the zip proxy in Bob's domain. So then he can forward the message to Bob's proxy, who has to look up at the location service where Bob can actually be reached right now, his current IP address, and then forward the message to Bob's device. Now at this point, Bob knows Alice's zip URI, but also, of course, her IP address, because it's included in the message. So then Bob can directly contact Alice, set up media parameters and everything, and start the session, and then eventually initiate the RTP real-time stream, so the actual voice communication. So this is basically how it works, and here you can actually see why security-wise we might want to look at zip, because zip starts the session, so any kind of authentication or encryption or anything we can already arrange in the zip session initiation, and then use it further for the protection of the real-time stream. Okay, some important differences between the public switch telephone network and the session initiation protocol I want to tell you about. First of all, if you look at signaling, in the public switch telephone network, most of the time I call this PSTN, we have signaling in a closed network. It's called SS7, you probably never heard of it. It's just there, it's not open, you cannot access it, but it works fine. Now with zip, we have signaling in an open network, and even worse, we have signaling in a highly insecure network. It's called the internet, and we all know that this is not a secure network. So we see that this causes some problems. Second, if you look at terminals, if you think of traditional telephones, like you all know, these are real simple devices. They don't offer much functionality. Now with zip, the network intelligence moves kind of to the terminals. So now in the phones, these are complex devices. They have a TCP/IP stack. They have zip functionality. They maybe have DNS support. They have all kinds of things. So they're kind of complicated. And of course, this leads to vulnerabilities. And there are already plenty of vulnerabilities in zip implementations. So this is another problem that we face. Another really important difference is if you look at mobility, in the PSTN you have no mobility at all. You just have a plug on the wall and you can plug in your phone and that's fine. Now with zip, you just need access to the internet, and this can be anywhere on the planet, and then you can use the same identity. So we have mobility, and this leads us directly to our next point, authentication. Because we have no mobility in the PSTN, users really get authenticated by plugging the wire in the wall. Now with zip, because we have mobility on the IP layer, we need some additional authentication on the application layer. And during this talk, I hope you will understand how this works and what the problems here really are. Now if you think about these last 2 points closer, you might say, well, the PSTN doesn't have mobility, so we don't need much authentication. That's true. But there is a phone network that we all use and know, maybe love, I don't know, that has these problems with mobility and authentication. And this is, of course, GSM. Who has a GSM phone? Right. I guess it's everybody. Mine is there. And GSM, of course, has the same problems. You have mobility, so you need authentication. So what does GSM do? So if we think about this for a minute, first of all, GSM uses smart cards. It's really important. You all know that you have a SIM card in your phone, and this is a highly secured crypto processor and everything. Secondly, if you think of GSM, there's only a limited number of providers. And Well, the security model at least is that they trust each other. If they really do, I don't know. In Germany, for example, we have four providers. And this is not the case with voice over IP. So for now, voice over IP devices, they don't use smart cards. And of course, we have plenty of providers and everybody can actually install its zip proxy. So it's quite different. So we might need something else. Now the key point here is that these differences between the PSTN that I've just shown you and zip have significant consequences for security. And if you think back during the next slides I will present you, each of the problems I will present you basically come from these differences. So the problems really are not a surprise if you think about it. So let's look at some current research problems. What's going on? First of all, zip is a protocol actually where security has been considered from the start, which is pretty good. The standard RFC 3261 has already some parts about security, and in there it's specified how zip can be used with S-MIME, with digit authentication, and with TLS and IPsec. And actually, zip is pretty often used with TLS together. However, if you think about this, if two users want to communicate for all these security mechanisms, they either need a pre-called trust relationship, which they might have, but if they don't have it, they need something like a PKI. They need certificates from their other partners. So for worldwide internet telephony, what we really need for these mechanisms is something like a universal trust infrastructure with one root that everybody trusts, and that's compatible for all users. Now, as you all know, we don't have this right now. There are plenty of problems with public key infrastructures. So all these protocols, or security mechanisms rather, they might work in a company, but they probably don't work worldwide, or at least not right now. So we need some additional mechanisms. So these are the problems I've chosen that I will discuss today. Of course, this list is not complete. I mean, there's plenty of other work going on. This is just what I picked during the time I have to show you. And these are some important areas of work, at least from my point of view. So first, authentication. I've already said this is a big problem. And here again, I guess this is not new now. The problem really is that zip users are mobile, so they change their location, meaning their IP address. And thus, we cannot use the IP address to authenticate users. And as long as we don't have a worldwide PKI, we might need something else to authenticate users. Now, what can we do? First approach, or an interesting approach, is ZRTP, which has been developed by Phil Zimmerman, the inventor of PGP. It really doesn't work on zip, but I included it here because it really is an alternative to authentication with zip. So ZRTP really, what it really offers is authentication of a known communication partner without a trust infrastructure. And how this can be done, I'll show you on the next couple of slides. But what it really is a Diffie-Hellman key exchange that is secure against man-in-the-middle attacks. And I will show you how this works. Now, this slide actually I took from one of our teaching exercises at the university that we do, because who knows what a Diffie-Hellman key exchange is? Oh, well, that's plenty. I didn't expect this. But Diffie-Hellman key exchange basically always is susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack. And how this works you can see here. If A wants to set up a Diffie-Hellman key exchange with B, A cannot be sure that there's a man in the middle who actually establishes a different key with B, and then just acts as a man in the middle and passes on messages. So this is a problem we have with Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. Now, how does this relate to ZRTP? Here again we have our picture, and we have Alicia and Beyonce who want to communicate. And for now, let's forget about the zip session. Let's assume they have established a session, but they have not authenticated each other. So we focus here on the RTP stream. But of course, they have established a session and set up an RTP stream. Now, of course, RTP uses the IP layer, so there are probably plenty of IP hops in between. And let's further assume there's an attacker on the IP layer here that wants to attack the communication, or at least the authentication between Alicia and Beyonce. So what happens is, we look here at the communication. Here we have the two. if Alicia and Beyoncé establish a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, the attacker can, of course, launch a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, what ZRTP does is it really displays the hash of the messages in the display of the phone. So, Alicia, for example, her phone sent message 1 and received message 4. So, the phone can display the hash of message 1 and 4. Now, on the other side, the phone of Beyoncé received message 2 and sent message 3, so it can display the hash of message 2 and 3. It's called the short authentication string. And obviously, if there isn't an attacker, the hash should be the same. Now, if there is an attacker, this hash will not be the same as this one. And now the key idea here with ZRTP is that the phone displays this hash, and the communication partners can read this within the RTP stream. Now, if an attacker still wants to launch a man-in-the-middle attack, he would need to parse the real-time conversation in real time and act accordingly. And this is the key idea here. So it's kind of using the fact that computers cannot parse messages or graphics as much as text. It's kind of the same as these capture things that you have on Yahoo Mail and stuff. So this is the key idea here behind ZRTP. Now there's a prototype implementation. It's called ZPhone by Phil Zimmerman, and you can download it, use it. And I've just shown it, taken it here to show you that you see here actually the short authentication string, and you can read it to your communication partners. So this is also really easy to use. People who are not familiar with security, they get displayed the string, and they can say, hey, well, what do you see? And the communication partners can exchange the string, and if it's the same, they can assume that there's no man-in-the-middle attack. If they don't know what a man-in-the-middle attack is, they can at least assume it's secure. So this is the idea. But there are other approaches. Within the IETF, there's an approach it's called identity assertion, which basically means the domain asserts the identity of the zip users in this domain. So again, here we don't see the domain, but this is Alice's domain, and this is Bob's domain. Now, if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she sends her invite, and then her local proxy challenges her and says, well, prove that you're Alice. And if the challenge is answered correctly, then the zip proxy will verify that identity, assert the identity, and sign this assertion. And then the invite message gets forwarded to the zip proxy in Bob's domain. Now this proxy then can verify the assertion and forward the message to Bob. I put here an RFC and some references. You don't need to write these down. They're all in the paper that you can download from the conference website. Now, if you think about this closely, it is a nice idea that only the domains need some key exchange and everything, and not every communication partners. But we really have the same problem. We would need a worldwide PKI for all domains, and also we would need some way that this proxy here, if it verifies the assertion, this proxy really doesn't know what happened here. I mean, it knows that this domain signed actually Alice, but it doesn't know anything about how this domain really verified the identity. It can be, I mean, we all don't know this from HTTPS web pages. There have been always certificate authorities that sign everything. So, I mean, if there's a domain that signs everything, that doesn't help us much. Okay. One last thing about authentication is I just want to mention this briefly, but this is another development. There are people in the zip community that have realized that TLS is, for some scenarios at least, not sufficient. You really have to think about this closely. If you're familiar with TLS and HTTP, how it's used in HTTPS, there's only one hop on the application layer. There's your client and your server, and on the application layer, it's just one hop. Now, if you think about zip, there are many hops on the application layer. So this brings up new issues. There might be intermediate hops that are not trustworthy. And of course, also all these application layer hops need keys between each other. So there are efforts underway that try to develop something new. Here I put the internet draft up here, but it's also, of course, in the paper if you're interested. That's further reading. Now, another problem that's been catching much attention is, of course, spam over IP telephony. Now, what is this? SPIT is the abbreviation for spam over internet telephony. And if you think about it, it's really different than email spam because voice over IP is a push technology and email is really a pull technology, meaning a voice over IP message I get will most of the time have my phone ring. So this is much more annoying than email spam. And because it is real time, that means that any content filtering, which is a very successful technique for email spam filtering, cannot be applied so easily for voice over IP. So we really need something else here. And of course, what you have to realize is that still the automated generation of spam messages is feasible for attackers. So it can be assumed that this will become a problem. So what can we do? One thing we can do is we could install something what's called a reverse Turing test, which is basically a machine trying to determine if the communication partner is a human or a computer. So a machine that asks the caller, what is 5 minus 2? And again, here the assumption is that an automatic spam computing machine cannot parse this conversation in real time, and thus cannot react, but a real communication partner can. Of course, there are problems with this. There are language problems, old people. I tried to find something other than old people, but I didn't come up with anything. But it is a problem for old people. Let's put it this way. What? Yeah, it can be a problem for old people, but I was trying to think of other people for whom it may.
My wife's family's Korean. If they call and they get a question in English, they won't understand.
Right, that's the other point I have here. The language is really a big problem too. So there are problems. Of course, another big problem is urgent calls. If you're in a hurry and you're shaky and you're nervous, like I'm right now, and you want to make a call, and then there's this machine saying, well, what's 18 minus 5? And you type in the wrong digit, and you know, and you get hectic. I mean, we all know this. So it might not be the best idea. Another thing that we can use, and I mean, many people have suggested this also for email spam, is a micropayment system. If we would have a micropayment system today, we probably wouldn't have that much email spam, because what email spam really, why it works is because sending an email costs nothing. So you can send 2 million emails and it doesn't cost you anything. And that's the same problem for voice over IP. So if we had a micropayment system, which of course we don't have today, but if we would have one, this could help us against fighting SPIT. Of course, if we had standard authentication, and I've just shown you that we don't have it today, but if we will eventually have it, this would help fight SPIT. It wouldn't fully solve the problem because of the reasons I've just shown you on the other slide. Even if we have signatures and assertions, we don't know what other domains use to verify identities. So as long as there are some huge domain out there that doesn't correctly verify identities, we only have the choice of blocking all calls of that domain, or we end up in trouble. So this is not a full solution. And another idea that can be used, and which is quite interesting, is what's called computational puzzles, meaning that each time you want to make a call, or at least your machine makes a call, it needs to solve some computational problem that causes CPU time, causes memory, which takes maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Now this is not a problem for regular call behavior, but it is a problem for spammers, because it means that a spammer then would need much computation power, so it makes it expensive for him. If you're interested in zip and spam, there's an interesting internet draft. Again, this is in the paper, where you can find some other ideas and get some insight into the problem. Now there are SPIT prevention implementations out there. Most of them are proprietary and not public. But this is one example I've chosen from NEC Europe, where they've published what they've done. I don't want to get into the details here. They've implemented it in a zip express router, and they use Turing tests and user feedback. So user can then say, well, this was spam and not, and also train the machine. If you're interested in this, Saverio Nicolini, who developed this thing, will talk about their SPIT implementation, or their SPIT prevention implementation. They're not doing SPIT, they're trying to prevent it actually. And that's at our seminar in Hamburg on February 1st. So if you're in Hamburg, last time I tried Google Nicolini SVS. SVS is the group I work at. The first link was the details of the talk. But if that doesn't work anymore, you can send me an email. If you're interested, just come. Of course, this is a joke here. It's public, right? You can come to the talk. Another problem. Well, yeah, it's a problem. Let's put it. It's a problem. It's lawful interception. If you don't know what the term is, who knows what lawful interception is? Well, that's plenty, but not all. It's basically legalized eavesdropping of communications by a government agency. And at first you might say, well, do we need this at all? We have it today. It's successfully used in the PSTN and in GSM networks to capture criminals and prosecute them. So there are reasons why we want this, and most countries have some laws that allow this. Now, I just said that it works fine in the PSTN and the GSM, or mostly fine. But for lawful interception of voice over IP, there are some additional problems. First of all, if you remember the first slide I've shown you, the first picture, usually the voice over IP provider and the internet service providers are different entities. So your real-time stream goes over different routers, also than your signaling. So the law enforcement agency really needs to intercept traffic at 2 points here, at your zip provider and at your ISP. Also, I've just said that signaling and payload take different routes, and of course we can have encryption. So nevertheless, there are standards being developed right now. There was also an interesting talk about lawful interception of voice over IP last year at the conference. If you haven't seen it, you can maybe download it. So standards are being developed, and there's much controversy on this. I've just recently read that not only the Swiss government, but also the German government considers developing Trojan horses that get deployed in the machines of the users they want to survey. So I think this is really dangerous. I mean, think about this. This really means that the governments develop malware to catch criminals. I mean, okay, they need to do this because the technology is so complicated, but is this the way we want to go? I don't know, I just feel it feels strange to me that governments develop malicious software.
RFC 1984 actually explains by the IETF why this shouldn't be done.
Why this shouldn't be done? Yeah, on the next slide I have also some arguments why this should not be done. Okay. Okay, well, good reference. I will read this because what I just said is I feel shaky about it. Maybe there are some good arguments there. Also, lawful interception will impose costs for this new industry. So there's some criticism there too from that side. And there's a famous paper that some famous security researchers have written. I'll give you a minute to read this. What you need to know is CALIA stands for, I always forget what it stands for, Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, and that is basically the US law for lawful interception and communication surveillance. And yeah, well, recently the FCC has thought about how this can be applied to voice over IP, and they've seen that this causes problems. And these researchers really think it's not the right thing to do. And I think what a key word here is they feel at least it's an architectured security breach. So there's much controversy. If you're interested, read this paper. It's really good, and it gives you a good overview of what's going on, why this is good or why this is not good. Okay. So our next topic is testing zip devices. Why do we need this? I've already, in the introduction, I've said that zip devices are more complex than traditional telephones. So we need some way to test these, and because smartphones usually are not open source, we probably need some black box testing here. So, okay, this is what I just said. Zip phones offer much more functionality, so they are probably susceptible to vulnerabilities. And yes, there are plenty of vulnerabilities out there. You can read Backtrack and everything. So there really is the danger that we have worms that don't exploit vulnerabilities in PCs anymore, but in phones. And I mean, zip phones are really hardware phones that you put on your desk, and then you might have a worm that exploits some vulnerability in some vendor and spreads from phone to phone. And this can happen any day. So we need some way to test these devices. Now, if you want to do this, this is really simple. Zip is an ASCII-based text message protocol. I've said this. It's just like HTTP. It sends ASCII request and response. You can log this with either real. It's not that hard. There are many tools out there. ZipZack is a nice tool. It's a Zip Swiss Army knife. It offers some nice basic features. ZipP is a very nice tool. I believe it's developed by Hewlett Packard, but it's open source. ZipP can read XML files with some scenario and then execute it on a test phone. There's also been a complete testing framework by the University of Oulu in Finland. It's called the Protos test suite, where they just used zip invite messages with all different kinds of variations in the headers and sent them to some phones, and many of them crashed and they found some vulnerabilities. And there's actually an RFC about this, because the zip community has realized that their phones are really, or their devices are really complex. So they have put up this RFC where you can find some messages that are standard valid, so regular zip messages that might cause problems, but also a lot of messages that are non-standard conform but might cause a phone to crash, like long header values and stuff like that. So if you're interested and you want to try this out, it's really simple. Think of a test scenario, you write a script using the existing tools, and you execute a test and log the result. And logging the result is really watching your phones if you want to start. So it's not that hard. What we've done, and I will show you this in the next couple of slides, we've written a really simple test tool that uses netcat and Python, and we've implemented this RFC. So we can now send these messages to any phone we want and log the result. And the tool also has some other tests I will show you in a minute. So first of all, here's an overview. If you want to test a zip implementation, if you want to start, you should probably install a zip proxy like OpenSare or something like that, because most phones here, this is our phone that we want to test, expect a proxy to be there. I mean, normally you don't need the proxy, you can communicate directly from A to B, but it's much easier if you install a proxy. And then you write some code and send a message to that proxy, which forwards it to this machine under test, and then you can obviously view how this machine reacts, and if it crashes, if it rings, if it doesn't. If you want to try out then, if the machine has crashed, you might send another valid message and see if it rings. Of course, you can also do denial of service attacks on a session. Let's assume here we have two phones that have set up a session or are establishing a session. Then you can use a test tool that sends in zip there are messages called buy or cancel on your phone under a test. And if the phone behaves correctly, it should ignore these messages because they're not coming from the originator of the session. In zip, there's what's called a dialog, and it's the combination of the call ID and the tag in the from header and the tag in the to header. There's really some protocol details here, but nevertheless, if any of these values are different, then it's not a message that belongs to the dialog and the phone should ignore it. Now we've tested this, sending some messages to a phone and see if it reacts and hangs up the call. Of course, if you get more advanced, then you probably will develop a tool here that simulates more than one phone and sends a message to a proxy, which forwards it to the phone under test, and then you send another message, like a buy or cancel message from that, from your tool as well, simulating more than one phone. And of course, you don't need several machines to do this. We've done this with VMware. We use VMware, so you can have your proxy in a virtual machine and your test tool in a virtual machine. And then if you're testing a soft phone, you can install it on the host system, and it works fine. So you don't need like plenty of machines to do this. Okay, so the tool we've developed is called Sisu. Like I've said, it's an implementation of this RFC I mentioned. But it also offers a denial of service test on a session, like I've just shown you, where you send a buy or cancel message to the phone under test after a session has been established or while a session has been established. It also offers denial of service tests on a phone, where it sends 10 10,000 or 1,000 invite messages to a phone, all different messages. And also it implements, let's say it's a buffer overflow search where you can put long values in chosen headers and then see how the phone reacts. Where the idea is here, if the phone crashes, then there's probably a buffer overflow somewhere, or there might be. Okay, this is what it looks like. It's just, like I've said, it's a Python tool, and there's a menu, and then you can send these messages. You can see here that we've installed it under Linux, but because it's Python, it runs under Windows just as well. So then when the phone crashes, you get these messages here. This is just a soft phone that crashed. You can see this easily. And if you have a hard phone that's somewhere on your network, you probably get this message, and then you see, okay, the phone doesn't react anymore, so it's down. Nothing fancy. So some preliminary results. We're still implementing this tool and enhancing it, but we've chosen 4 phones just to see if it works and check it out. And some of the things we found out, just briefly here. This is a valid invite message from this RFC I mentioned, so it's just a regular zip standard message. And out of the 4 phones that we've chosen for this short test, only phone 1 rings correctly, which is what it should do. Phone 3 crashes, which certainly is not nice. And phone 2 and 4, they don't react at all, even this is a regular standard conform message. Then if you use a denial of service test where you send 10,000 messages at the same time to a phone, all different messages, 2 phones react correctly, and 2 phones is, well, we put here stressed, which basically means, I should have brought the sound, the phone really rings stressed. You need to listen to the actual sound. It is stressed. It doesn't ring regular. Yeah, it's hard to describe. You need to listen yourself. And then also we did this denial of service test on the session, and the phones we tested really behaved correctly, but we found some other phones where you can successfully tear down a session when you send a message that's not conforming, when you send a message that's really not within the dialog. So there are some header values that are not correct, but the phone really accepts them as if they were in the session. Some other problems I just briefly want to mention because I think they're also important, but I didn't have the time during this talk to mention what's going on. First of all, anonymity, of course, is a problem because zip phones you communicate over the internet. So any intermediary can see who called whom, for how long. The RTP stream can be eavesdropped easily. You can use Wireshark these days and save some packets and then make a WAV file out of it. It's really easy. Okay, I skipped this. You can use back-to-back user agents if you want to solve this. Also, emergency calls. We all know that IP networks don't offer quality of service. So if we want to prioritize emergency calls, it's really hard to do. There's some work going on in this area. It's called ECRIT. If you're interested, you can check that out. And also, I think a big problem is or will be usability of phones, because eventually, and most phones have already, the phones have some credentials in them. Let it be your password stored or some certificates. And we all know that HTTP websites where you have an HTTP web connection and you see a certificate, then users already have trouble. I mean, if we all know this, how is this going to work with the phone? You call somebody and the phone displays, well, the certificate of your callee is not valid anymore. What's my grandmother going to do? I don't know. And then actually, how did you display this on these small phones? So I think personally there will also be some issues. Okay, I guess I have another 15 minutes, that's good. Because now I want to come to a different area, and that's kind of the future security for zip. It's peer-to-peer zip. What is peer-to-peer zip? It's basically, well, it says it right here, it's using a peer-to-peer network for user registration and location lookup. So in the slide I've showed you earlier, you use lots of servers to do this, but you can of course also use a peer-to-peer network, which is kind of nice. Not really what I mean with peer-to-peer zip is ZipShare. ZipShare is a file sharing network that just uses zip as a message format, but it's not internet telephony, it's not user registration, so it's different. And of course, Skype doesn't use zip at all, although it is peer-to-peer telephony. Okay, there are some reasons why we want to do this. Of course, we have the usual reasons for peer-to-peer networks. We have better scalability, we have robustness. Yeah, and we probably have some cost reduction because we don't need to take care of our servers. So how does it work? Here again, we have the slide I've shown you earlier. Here's regular zip communication. And what you realize here is that all these components that I've circled here are really central components that you need for registration and location lookup with zip. So if we take them out, we might say, well, how does Alice then find Bob? So we can put something else in there, which is called a distributed hash table, which is basically a structured peer-to-peer network that offers some formal guarantees on search requests and stuff like that. I don't have the time to go into detail here, but then again, Bob can join this distributed hash table, Alice can do so, and then Alice can look up Bob's zip URI in this distributed hash table. And on the next slide, I will show you a bit more how this works. Just to give you a rough overview, here we have, again, a distributed hash table, a peer-to-peer network where we have a couple of nodes. Each node has an ID, which is formed by hashing the IP address of the node, and then each node stores some content. Okay, so far so good. And then this distributed hash table offers two primitives, basically just store a key or look up a key. And under that key there is some content. So if Alice and Bob want to use this for internet telephony, what they do is, first of all, Bob joins the distributed hash table with his node. So he hashes his IP address and then joins this distributed hash table. Think of it as just as a peer-to-peer network. Alice does the same thing. She has her IP address and then joins the network. And then Bob, of course, wants to be able to receive calls, so he has to do this register message that he usually sends to his registrar. So here he has his zip URI, and he hashes this to, let's assume it's 206, to find out who is responsible in this peer-to-peer network for his content. So he can then store 206 in the network, and in this case, node 215 is responsible and stores the key, which is the hash of his URI, and the corresponding IP address. So if then Alice wants to call Bob, she can also hash his zip URI and ask to the peer-to-peer network in a message, well, I want to look up 206. So then there's some routing in the overlay, which I don't have time to go into detail here. But eventually, from the overlay, she will get back node 215 is responsible. And she can then contact node 215 because the overlay gave her the IP address. And then node 215 will give her the IP address of Bob, and she can contact Bob. Now, if you're used to think in security, you realize quickly, well, what is about node 215 here? I don't know this node. This is just a node in the peer-to-peer network that stores some content, that stores my IP address, my registration. And of course, if you have a huge peer-to-peer network, this node also changes over time. It might leave the network and the content gets stored at another node. So there are some issues here. Yeah, I put them down here on the slide. First of all, we don't have a central authority, so we don't have trust in other nodes. These are just arbitrary nodes that we have. Then I've said this already, the distributed hash table is usually, or if we think of a real deployment, it'll be highly dynamic, meaning we have lots of churn, nodes leave the network, nodes enter the network, and thus we have some problems here. Also, of course, adversary nodes that we are in the network can spoof, they can falsify messages, insert false messages, they can do all kinds of things. So there has been some work on distributed hash table security, mostly focusing on the availability of the whole network. But clearly, if we want internet telephony with zip, we also have to consider attacks on single nodes and single keys, where single zip URIs basically that store their content there. And of course, we have performance issues as well, because we want to initiate a phone call conversation. And also, we want to consider the application protocol. So distributed hash table security is really application specific, and there are some special issues for zip. Yeah, I guess we have some time, so there's just a real quick example. Again, we have a distributed hash table here with a couple of nodes that store some content, and we have an attacker that says, well, I know the person whose content is stored at 212, I want to attack that content. So what the attacker does is it joins the network, arbitrary, so it hashes his IP address. And if he's lucky, or sooner or later, he will get a message of somebody who wants to call that person and says, well, I need the content for 212. So the attacker then can pass on the message, and on the way back, it can exchange, you see this down here, the IP address, it gives back to the originator of the request. Now if the attacker is clever, he probably will give back an IP address under his control, so he can also launch an attack on the RTP stream as well. Okay, this is just a rough overview how this works. Of course, there's much more detail involved. So what can we do for authentication in peer-to-peer zip? Basically, there's three things we can do. We can, of course, add a central authority, but I guess we don't want to do that because we want to keep up with the spirit of peer-to-peer computing. We don't want a central authority there for the reasons I've put up there. Yeah, a lot of researchers have introduced reputation management systems in the absence of a central authority, for example, for file sharing. So we could use this for zip as well. But then we have new questions because most reputation systems out there are basically the eBay type reputation management where you get a 1-0 decision for a successful transaction, or with file sharing a successful file retrieval. But with the zip this is different. What do you gain reputation for? And so the issues, and this really hasn't been developed. What you also could use is a self-certifying zip URI. I've proposed to do this. There's a reference in the paper if you're interested. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go in this, but with a self-certifying approach, you really have a zip URI that is cryptographic, and you can sign messages, and everybody can verify these. So to summarize, because we don't have a central authority, there is authentication is really a tough problem in a peer-to-peer network. I guess this is obvious. So I'm almost done. Here's my conclusion, and it's really short. So I guess we have time for questions, which is good. I've tried to show you the difference between the public switch telephone network and zip-based voice over IP, and I hope I've shown you through this talk that these are really significant differences that affect security, and basically all the security problems we have today follow from these differences. There are many efforts underway to secure zip-based voice over IP. I've given you insight into some domains and mentioned some others. And zip security is an interesting, still evolving field, and I should have underlined here still evolving. There's still much work going on, standards are being developed, standards that have been developed are changed. So this is an active field where lots of work is going on, and still many things are not clear how they will end up eventually. And finally, if we end up with a peer-to-peer solution, we will have many new and different security challenges, so there's lots of work to do. And I hope that I gave you an insight on how all these security problems, how important they really are, and you get an idea what the challenges are. So thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, you can also send me an email, or I guess now we have 10 minutes. Thank you. Any questions? Oh.
You told several times about the need for a global PKI infrastructure. But what about storing the keys or certificates for the domains in DNS?
Well, I mean, DNS is not secure.
Yeah.
Right?
It's been deployed by 2 countries already.
Well, I mean, but DNSSEC basically is a public key infrastructure as well. You can do this, yeah. I mean, it's the same problem in a different protocol, so to speak. I mean, if first of all, normal DNS is not secure. You agree, right?
Yeah.
DNSSEC, in a way, is secure, but it relies on a public key infrastructure as well, right?
Well, even without DNSSEC, it would. I think it would reduce. At least for some kinds of problems, the amount of intrusion possible, like for spamming or...
Well, I mean, Yeah, okay. Go on.
Using DNS, you'll at least protect against passive attacks. So sure, you're not protected against active attacks, but at least you got all the passive listeners on prevention there. So you can look up a key in DNS and get a secure connection going if you're using IPsec or something else.
Well, I mean, if we had DNSSEC, I agree with you, then we could use this. But otherwise, I mean, we have DNS cache poisoning and all that stuff. I mean, it's just in a different layer. I don't see.
But those are all active attacks. At least you'll prevent all the passive eavesdropping of the person next to you in Starbucks.
Okay, yeah. Other questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned back-to-back user agents. What is it, and how would they solve the problem that you said that they would solve?
Yeah, okay. I got over this really quickly. But when you think about anonymity, right? Usually how's anonymity solved? You have something like a mix server that gets lots of messages, exchanges values, and then passes them on, right? And the same you could do with what's called back-to-back user agent in zip, which is basically a server or a proxy that takes headers, replaces the values, and passes it on. Of course, it then stores this connection, this how it changed headers in a table, and then if message get back, it can pass these on again. So it's basically, back-to-back user agent is a zip term. It stands for a server that reacts as a user agent in both directions. And this is exactly what we need for anonymity or pseudonymity, because then the receiver of the message thinks it's coming from the pseudonymity service. Okay?
I actually just have a small remark. You mentioned some approaches to fight against spit problems, maybe. And you mentioned the micropayments approach and maybe some computational stuff. I think it's a bit outdated nowadays, since those spam guys already use botnets, and so they could also use the computational power, which is maybe then remotely distributed, or they could use other people's micropayments. So I think this doesn't
right.
help
I mean,
anymore.
the micropayment solution only works. If we had a botnet, or if the spammer has a botnet, then it doesn't work, of course, yeah. That's true. It's just, I mean, all the solutions against spit I've put up, I probably didn't say this clear. These are all some solutions that work in some scenarios, but there is no general solution for spit. We probably, and then the prototype I've shown you, again, that will be presented in Hamburg in more detail, is, as far as I know, a mixture of all these approaches. So, there is probably not the approach against spit, or at least from my point of view, because all of these approaches have some issues.
Another question about spit approaches. There's a third approach to spit prevention, which doesn't look at the content at all, but and is only feasible for larger voice providers by looking at call patterns and identifying spit senders based on their call pattern. You see if there's an automatic dialer in work.
And I assume that most voice over IP providers are starting to look into this. I didn't put this up, but I agree with you, yes. Mm-hmm. And I assume that, like I've said, spit is a field where there's, I assume, lots of research going on that's non-public, because it eventually also will be, it relates with patents and there's markets and revenue and all that kind of stuff. So I assume that large voice over IP providers look into this and have already some kind of IDS that filters out spit messages. I know that GSM providers, for example, do this with SMS messages and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. But there's, then there's one problem left. If you do identify a spit call at the provider, you're not legally allowed to just drop it, which is another area of concern.
Say again, you're not illegally allowed to
Legally,
drop?
you're not allowed to drop it, because that would be suppressing communications. You can't be sure that it's spit and that the receiver doesn't want it. So this is an area...
Is this true? I mean, as far as I know, providers drop messages if they think it's malicious. They do.
There's a common carrier status for telcos that wasn't... Sorry. There's a common carrier status where you're not allowed to do anything with... You should just be guaranteed to deliver the message.
That comes back to the issue if voice over IP providers are telecommunication providers.
Yes, exactly.
And that's different in every country. I know in the US they are considered if they have more than, I think, 10,000 users. And in Germany they are half considered. So it's also depends on regulation and the country where you're in.
And speaking of regulation, you mentioned the lawful interception. Of course, if you're using SIP, you're using IP network, and for IP networks, there are lawful interception standards already. So, for instance, in Europe, there's the ETSI standard called Transport over Intercepted IP Traffic, which you can find the specification on OpenTap.org. But it's basically, as soon as they know who you are and what IP address you'll be using, what provider you use, they can actually lawfully intercept you at the IP level and take all your traffic.
But what if you change your ISP every time you make a phone call by using an internet cafe and you use a zip provider in some country that is not within legal range of your government?
I'm not doing the government's job. Yes, it's very difficult to get people who are really smart, but
So-
most criminals are not smart.
I mentioned this paper there, and what they write is that basically what it comes down to, if you want a complete lawful interception for voice over IP, you will have complete IP interception. And I don't know if this is where it's getting, but it seems to be that it's getting there. Yeah.
It's already there.
Yeah, but is it deployed?
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm not sure.
Yes, it's mandatory for many ISPs. For instance, I know in Holland it's mandatory that if you don't comply to the TIIT specifications, they can shut you
It depends
down.
on the country, right? Okay.
But all the ministers of justice have come together half a year ago and they've agreed on a European-wide standard implementation. So this will spread over the entire EU.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So about lawful interception, it was mentioned last year here that at least some European countries want to require from the registration server that he can do lawful interception.
Right, but that only helps if the person you're trying to catch is using a registration server within the legal range of the country. Yeah. And I mean, we're talking the internet, so I mean, if there's it's the same with servers for malware that are located in some other country. You know, it's the same problem.
Any more questions?
Other questions?
Okay. You talked about your testing tool. Mm-hmm. Did you test it against remote SIP proxies? And if yes, how did they react?
Say again, test against what?
Against remote SIP proxies, not local ones.
No, we didn't. I mean, we didn't test it against proxies yet, and also not against remote proxies, because you got to be careful if you send messages that you know are going to cause the proxy to send it to some proxy that's generating revenue for a company, right? So we wouldn't do that. But what you can do is you can find out what implementation. I didn't put this up here, but we've 2 years ago we had a test of German zip providers where we just looked into the messages, and most zip providers let you know what zip proxy they're using from the it's within the message. So of course you don't know what configurations they have, but you can, if you find a vulnerability, you probably know that they are susceptible to it. Yeah, but you shouldn't do these. I mean, you shouldn't send malicious messages to a proxy that's in use. Okay, more questions? Yeah, back.
You mentioned this approach with the self-certifying SIP URIs for peer-to-peer SIP networks, but then you also say you need to somehow find out the right URI to your user, because no one wants to have a user ID like 4W3X5031 or something like this. But then if you do this in some external service, then you bind your whole security system, you bind it on some external service. So then you could easily distribute the public keys via your external system.
Very well observed. That's exactly a problem that is not solved with the self-certifying zip URIs. I call this problem bootstrapping authentication, and you've just described it pretty well. I mean, at some point, if you want to communicate with somebody you don't know, you need to look up his and that person didn't give you his card or send you an email. then you need some service where you find the address of that person, and that doesn't matter if it's a self-certifying zip URI or regular zip URI. If I know I want to call Phil Zimmerman, I don't know his zip URI, so I have to look it somewhere. I have to look it up somewhere. So well, I call this problem bootstrapping authentication, and yeah, that's not solved with self-certifying zip URIs. But for peer-to-peer networks, self-certifying zip URIs have the nice property that any intermediary node can verify that the registration or message is correct without even doing any key exchange with the sender of the message. So that's kind of nice for peer-to-peer networks, but it doesn't solve the bootstrapping authentication problem, right?
But why don't you, for example, prefix the location with another prefix? I mean, do a prefix to the username for location and one prefix for the public key, and then they will land on different IDs in the overlay, and you have some security, because you must control quite a big part of the network to be able to control both with the location and the public key.
Well, there are some ideas, and what you mentioned goes in that direction. But you must not forget that for zip you cannot include the location, because zip is location independent by well, not by default, but that's the whole point. I mean, a zip identity is valid from everywhere, so it's really not, you cannot bind it to the location statically in some way.
Yes, but you could prefix one magic for location and one magic for the public key.
I haven't thought about this, but maybe we can talk afterwards if you have some ideas. I'm always interested.
No.
More questions? I guess not. Okay. Thank you.